Okay, welcome to the May 9th KCP-Edge / KCP Community Meeting. This is being conducted under the CNCF Rules of Conduct, so everybody be nice. So the agenda today is talking about continuing work on pieces and or concepts from KCP. Let's see. Stefan has started a document. I think it's a little more, yes, was that you? Very good. Thank you. A little more procedurally focused than I want to start with. I think I want to start with focusing on the what to do, and then get on to the procedural details and supporting infrastructure type details. In my mind, there are um, so three concepts that have, I think, gotten people's interest from KCP that I've heard people interested in continuing to work on in some fashion. One is the so-called logical clusters from KCP. One is the Kube, well, it's already partly embodied in KubeBind. It's the API export and binding functionality. And one is a kind of a cluster of ideas around this single binary. I would in fact break that down into two parts. One is the cut down server or the intermediate server between the level of API, the existing API server repo and the Kube API server. And the other related idea is the single binary, which bundles together the cut down API server, a single node etcd cluster, and the cut down Kube controller manager. So I think the first thing to do really is to poll for interest and available work or manpower to continue to work on these things. And let me just stop there and ask for commentary. I'm hearing nothing,
Okay.
so I suppose yes,
So
go ahead.
no, let me break the ice. Maybe that's necessary. Yeah, so we are interested in logical clusters and basically what is on Stefan's graph, the core area of KCP. And we do have at least one person in terms of manpower that could work on this. This guy. I'm looking at my manager. He's not shaking his head. So yes, I think I can take that as a statement. I'm not super familiar with the code base. I read through most of it, but I wouldn't describe myself as an expert in the Kubernetes internals. So make of that what you want.
All right.
So
And just to remind those of us here, you're from Kubernetes, is that right?
exactly, yeah. Sorry,
Okay.
didn't mention
Thank
that.
you. All right. Any other comments? All right. I'd like to start talking about the logical clusters. I think that is the most radical, challenging, and interesting part of this. So I think that's the first thing to talk about. And I see a few sorts of activities to do to work on that. One is so I'll just start breadth first. One is I would like to make another run at taking this idea upstream. As you know, that was attempted earlier, and it was rejected. The story I got was because it was sold as multi-tenancy. Well, the attempt was to sell it as multi-tenancy, and KCP doesn't have something as strong in isolation as people would expect from that word. So I think if we try to sell something that's not described as multi-tenancy, only a level of virtualization, we would have a better chance in collecting use cases and hope to take the use cases upstream and make an argument for this higher level of namespacing. That's one avenue of work, but it's definitely a long-term project. Making a big change upstream does not happen fast. There are a couple of shorter-term things. Maybe of intermediate value is continuing work along the lines that Vince Prignana began, creating a client-side abstraction layer that can give a multi-cluster aware controller the ability to deal with multiple logical clusters based on a variety of providers, or I don't know what word he used exactly. Um, but the idea would be to take that and make it a version of that that's not dependent on controller runtime, but is usable by any kube client, and that would be an intermediate way of proceeding. Um, and I think that's more, an upstream sale is iffy and very long term. I'm pretty confident we can do something on that order. And even shorter term is, I, at least in my project, I'm going to continue to use KCP, to the core of KCP. And the fact that it's based on Kube 1.24 is a pain point. I'd really like to get the rebase to 1.26 completed. That'll give us some breathing room for the intermediate, long-term work. So, right first, that's it. Stefan.
So I added your attempt on a cap for logical clusters. I'm not so optimistic that this will go through. I think it's more than just multi-tenancy, which of course is it's a big claim to add that, but I think more or less all controllers in upstream in the controller manager, which are generic, like garbage collection and namespace solution, all those things must be adapted in a non-trivial way, and this will be hard to get through. Anyway, so I added this as a third point there. Yeah, so I also added your 3 value propositions in the beginning. I'm not sure we can split them in a sensible way, because they are pretty much, at least if we are pragmatic, they're pretty much bundled. Without big investment into KCP, there's no way to split those 3. Logical clusters alone are pretty much unusable, I would say. In theory, you can remove tenancy like the workspaces, but you get something that is so hard to use. I don't think there's so much value. So I think it's really those 3 as one package you have to take or you have to reject, which means do KCP or you don't.
You certainly mean KCP core, not including
This is
TLC.
KCP core, yeah. And in my task list there, of course, you see the TMC part. So I think we probably all agree that TMC should be separated. We should finish that and then do whatever we want with it, like deprecate or something. Maybe there's somebody else who wants to maintain that, but it should be independent. There's another hand, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Marvin.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, because the last time I think we talked about API exports and API bindings on one of the community calls. I don't recall which one. I'm sorry about that. It seemed to sound like that is a huge source of complexity in KCP, and it seemed like there wasn't a huge interest to maintain it. But now the reality is we can't remove it.
Yeah, it's like that. This is deep in KCP. It's used everywhere in the code we have built. And I don't think this is, I mean, for maintenance, NDSCS where you can give us comments. I don't think this is a big part. Like the logical clusters are really the big changes. Exports and bindings. I mean, there's no sense to really discuss that so deeply because it's hard to remove them. And you are left with something which is not really helpful.
Okay, understand. I understood. I just wanted to clarify that because I understood it differently, and it's just good to know. Thank you.
Can I ask? I'm a little surprised to hear that because there is kubebind and it's not intertwined with anything in KCP.
KubeBind is basically it's an attempt to do similar things which we do in KCP, but in a pure kube way. But it's not KCP. Like you don't get logical clusters and
right. So could we pursue an approach that said, take the work of Vince Prognana to get some kind of an abstraction layer over a variety of ways of getting multiple logical clusters, and also take kubebind. Each of those is independent of the other. Use them together. Could one do that?
not really, I think.
Can
Like
you explain?
KubeBind is not exports and bindings. Like this is, I mean, KubeBind is a syncing mechanism, syncing of CRDs between two clusters. It's not multi-cluster in the sense of logical clusters where you can have wildcard requests and those things.
Right. Yes. Yes, I'm aware, right?
So KubeBind is basically, you lose all the server side of the whole value proposition. Andy has his hand up for quite some time.
Yes, Andy.
I'm mostly with Stefan. So the types that KCP adds for mostly like core and APIs and tenancy, but I realize like, you know, tenancy we could put off to the side. Those CRDs are projected into logical clusters today using one of two different mechanisms. One is this concept of system provided CRDs that the KCP itself is responsible for owning those API definitions, and it controls which logical clusters get access to those APIs. And as a KCP shard admin, you can't even override that stuff. Then the other mechanism is with the exports and bindings. So things the workspaces API type, for example. And I realize this is tenancy, and you could say this is an optional layer above, but just to complete the discussion, workspaces as an API is projected into any logical cluster that wants to use it using an API binding. So you could re-architect that and say, well, no, I'm going to go install the CRDs in every logical cluster that needs them. That explodes the memory usage as you get to a large, very large number of logical clusters. The alternative would be something like KubeBind, but KubeBind would also be installing the same CRD over and over again in every logical cluster that needs to use it. So you could explore that, but I think it wouldn't give you the efficiency you're looking for.
So I think you touched on an important point to explore, efficiency. Let's be a little bit explicit here about the efficiency that people are looking for, and think are achievable. I'll tell you my point of view. I do my concern has been edge computing, and we do have a design that involves mailbox workspaces, one per edge cluster. So I would like to be able to have a large number of those. However, I also recognize that the use of those is never going to scale in all cases to what we want. So it's really there's it's already qualitatively inadequate. It's practically adequate in some situations. For me, it's a matter of moving the boundary between where it's feasible and not where where it is and is not feasible. That is to say, the efficiency moves that boundary, but doesn't change the qualitative fact that it's going to work in some cases and not in other cases. So that's my. And the other thing is, unless and until we either get this sold upstream or have sufficient manpower to maintain KCP core, I just have to give up on the efficiency that's in KCP core today. So let me stop and actually ask two factual background questions here. What manpower have we got to maintain KCP core, and what interest do people here have, needs or expectations or requirements on efficiency? So I'm opening the floor for other people who are interested in this to speak.
I mean,
Yes, Sebastian. Go ahead, Sebastian.
as
Oh,
a
Steph.
primarily three parties here, it's Coematic, IBM, and Red Hat, aka Stefan ex Red Hat. As we from Coematic already showed some interest and capacity, I think as Red Hat is out of the picture, it's mostly at you folks, IBM, like how much you are willing to contribute, or did I miss someone here who is not in that list?
No, I think you've got it, right? We've heard that the Red Hat people have been reassigned. I can tell you on the IBM side, we don't have a lot of manpower that we can dedicate to maintaining KCP core as it is today. If there were some way of identifying some significantly smaller subset, we could maybe talk about that. But as it is today, I'm not seeing it. So I'm seeing one person from Kubernetes, a fraction of a person from IBM, and no people from Red Hat. That's the manpower I'm seeing right now. Stefan.
I can also speak up for some capacity. I cannot talk about it yet, but something will come.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. So we are talking about taking things apart, which we have. What I understand from you, Mike, IBM, you want logical clusters. Chromatic wants logical clusters. I think my future employee wants logical clusters. So it's pretty clear if we want KCP, then it's about logical clusters. And I think, as we talked about before, this pretty much means that tenancy must be a thing and API exports bindings must be a thing. Anything beyond that is probably optional. There are
Okay, yes,
yeah.
Just to be clear,
okay, go ahead.
for
Sorry.
people here, by tenancy you mean workspaces, right?
Yes, just the workspace types maybe as well.
Right. Pardon me? Types?
Workspace types. Workspace types.
Cluster logical. Okay, workspace types. Yeah, right. The concepts are on workspaces. Okay. All right. So my problem is, I'm seeing a manpower problem here. I'm seeing a manpower problem here. I mean, from IBM's point of view, we also do want something. I think we would very much like to have something like kubebind or API exported binding. I still not sure I understand the answer here about the intertwining with logical clusters. When I asked about what if we did something like we took Vince's work, right, and liberated it from controller runtime and used kubebind and just use the two together, we would not have the efficiency.
Those have nothing to do with logical clusters. So if we start with the assumption people want logical clusters, then kubebind doesn't help and Vince's work doesn't help either.
Right, it's clear that kubebind doesn't. I was never suggesting that kubebind does, but wasn't Vince's thing about introducing an abstraction layer?
Yeah, Vince's thing was to replace the controller runtime part here and build something into upstream controller runtime, which allows you to plug in a low-level client which can talk to logical clusters. So maybe it can replace the controller runtime piece here in my document. I don't know, and you will know.
Yeah, it doesn't.
I mean, nothing beyond.
It doesn't help you implement logical clusters. It's a client library or a portion of a client library that lets you say, I'm going to write a controller or a client that wants to talk to arbitrary backends where they may be real clusters or they may be logical clusters, but to the implementer, it doesn't matter.
Exactly. And I'm sorry, I didn't fully express the idea. Yes, that is part of the problem, right? There's really a client side part of the problem and a server side part of the problem. So what Vince did was introduce a client-side abstraction layer that could deal with multiple server-side solutions to the problem. He started with a server-side that is based on kind clusters. Obviously, he was aiming to get to a server-side based on KCP core. And I think obviously that could be extended to other server sides as well. For example, both IBM and Red Hat have services. IBM has its, we call it ROCs, Kubernetes as a service, and Red Hat has the Hypershift, which is OpenShift as a service. And both of those have a technology for stamping out a runtime variable collection of clusters. And presumably at the core of both of those, we don't need the worker nodes and all the networking gorp, but at the core of it has also got to be something that can stamp out, API servers combined with etcd cluster combined with controller manager, right? And that's the important point, which is there's some control plane that can stamp out, the control node part of a cluster, and so there are these other implementations around.
That's all fine, but again, logical clusters give you 2 orders of magnitude cheaper workspaces. Like a Hypershift cluster or whatever you use as Cube needs at least 1 GB of RAM. Hypershift will need even more than that. So we talk about 1 GB or maybe 5 GB for one control plane for one workspace versus maybe 10 megabytes or something. So are we interested, the parties we enumerated, in this 2 orders of magnitude? That's a big question.
Yes.
And what do we pay for maintenance?
Please, yes, indeed. Let's talk explicitly about efficiency. Sebastian.
I mean, not sure how much you know about us, but we have exactly the same concept. Like Hypershift is running Kubernetes on Kubernetes, and there's a reason why we want to use it for some areas KCP instead of individual control planes because of the overhead of the control planes. So that's, I think for us, it's not a workable way to go that direction. We have this, and the overhead is too big.
So just to summarize then, I think you're telling me that Kubernetes is definitely interested in the efficiency delta that you get from adding the virtualization into the server.
Yeah, I mean, that's like having logical clusters in that efficient way, how KCP is doing it. That's the main reason why we are interested in looking into KCP and not running individual control planes and use this as a separation. We could do already, and there are good reasons, or mostly it's too expensive to operate this at a larger scale. Only for managing, for example, CIDs for us. And that's the reason why we're looking into something like KCP.
Okay. Can I ask, Stefan, I am a little surprised at the gigabyte, just to spin up an empty control plane, right? I mean, we're talking about, I mean, if we did like KCP does, right? That's one etcd server, one cut down API server, one cut down kube controller manager.
Yeah, so K3S is basically 1 GB plus minus. Same for the equivalent in OpenShift.
Okay.
That's where it comes from.
This is going to be a bit of a geeky question, but when we're talking about efficiency, we're going to run multiple of these on a node, a Linux node that has memory mapping, and if I believe you memory map read only the same file several times, it doesn't actually consume several copies of the memory. So I don't know how much of this is actually gets realized in this case. How much of the memory is coming from mapped code versus process specific data. A gigabyte sounds like a lot. Like,
I would run
where it's coming from.
I would run benchmarks and get the numbers. I don't think it's worth speculating here. Like, I think Stefan is probably on point, but worth confirming and not debating anymore right now.
Okay. But in any case, there is certainly going to be a difference. There's no doubt that there's going to be a difference. Well, I guess we are debating the quantity. Okay, Stephanie, you have your hand up. Is there something else?
Yeah, I'm still interested in talking about the effort for maintenance, like the
Yes, that's another part of it.
procedure
So maybe,
of what we actually have to do.
right. So again, I want to. So I'm definitely seeing a manpower problem here. So I want to really push hard on how much we can cut down on the work to be done. Okay. So so you're telling me that the API binding and export part of it is a small amount of work. And the most important, I think, one of the big pain points is, the fact that there's a fork of Kubernetes. Let's just focus on the logical clusters for a moment, right? Unless and until we sell the concept upstream, what's the work involved in maintaining? Let's just start with the logical clusters. Let's just cut it down just to help us understand, right? If we don't, so workspaces are a style of using multiple logical clusters, right? They're kind of a layer on top of logical clusters in KCP today. What's the work involved in, could we identify some kernel or core that just has logical clusters? And could we identify that? And if so, how big would it be? What would be the work in maintaining it?
That's basically the question for Andy. How much time have you invested in the rebase?
So the rebase was probably 5 calendar days with all the knowledge that I have in my head about how everything works here to get it to a state where it is compiling and able to run tests. Unfortunately, either something changed in our Prow environment or there was a regression in, I don't know, CPU usage or something, and we're having issues just getting through the E2E tests. Things are taking longer than wait forever test timeout to get through worker queues and get processed. So I don't think I've identified any like regressions in functionality. It's more just things are taking longer. So somebody who's not familiar with doing a rebase before, I would probably conservatively quadruple the amount of time. So call it a month. And maybe it's less. I am probably about 3/4 of the way through documenting the rebase process, and I will open that up as a pull request as soon as it's ready. And I would certainly be willing to advise on doing a rebase for whoever does the next one. I would imagine the delta between 126 and 127 is smaller than 124 to 126. So as soon as 126 is done, somebody wanted to try 127, I'd be happy to advise. But I mean, in terms of the changes to Kubernetes for logical clusters, everything that relates to etcd storage in terms of the key that is used for what goes into etcd, doing lists and watches that span logical clusters is a special case that has to be handled in there. And there's the controllers as well. So any controller that exists in Kubernetes today that we want to use going forward either has to be made logical cluster aware, which can be a short half an hour to an hour's worth of work if it doesn't maintain any state, to much longer if it does maintain state. So for example, if the controller stores in memory a map of namespace to whatever, anything that is namespace scoped or even cluster scoped, if that's stored, if instances of those things are stored in a map or anywhere in the controller on the struct, you have to make that a map of maps. So you have to map from logical cluster to whatever the original data structure was. Or you do what we've done for a couple things in KCP, where you essentially create a new controller that is able to see when logical clusters come and go, and then it spawns and deletes instances of whatever the controller is, namespace, garbage collection, who knows what. So you do have to deal with the controllers. Those are the two big things that I can think of. And then there's the API exports and bindings piece, which is mostly mucking around with the API extensions code.
Yeah. Stefan, you have your hand up?
Oh, it's still up.
Oh,
Not much to add,
okay.
I think.
All right, Andy. Yes. Could you touch on that? I think one of the things that we touched on, but maybe we should talk about a little more explicitly here, is the way that the KCP implementation of API export and binding gains efficiency compared to creating CRDs per logical cluster. That is involved in the fork of Kubernetes. It's not just add-on code.
I'm not sure it's the right question. Yeah, there are benefits for efficiency if you use that externally. But I think the much more important point is that nearly everything in KCP today is implemented using that mechanism. So
yes,
when
I've noticed that myself. Whenever I look at anything, I find API export and binding involved.
So I'm just fearing if we look on changing that, of course you can change that in some way. Like we had system CRDs for a long time for lots of the things, but looking on the amount of people and being pragmatic, removing exports is probably not the thing I would do.
Well, I'm trying to understand that, because to my mind, at least, I frankly I hate fork development. The idea of carrying a fork terrifies me. But you guys keep saying it's not a problem, so I'm trying to calm down and
I'm not
not run
saying
away screaming.
it's not a problem, but I'm saying, I mean, the logical clusters are there anyway. Everything that Andy just described is there. And I have no hope that we get those things quickly into upstream. So we have the fork. And then the exports are the smallest issue.
But again, so I'm trying to help me understand. So the export, import, or binding stuff, it is involved in the fork. It does involve some changes to Kubernetes.
Yes.
Is that
Yes,
right?
there are some additional changes, yes.
Can you just outline what they are?
We have a custom implementation of the lister for custom resource definitions. And that custom lister is used in the serve HTTP method of the custom resource handler in the API extension server. And that is used for the system CRDs that I mentioned before that are, KCP wide things. It's used for exported schemas to get those bound into logical clusters. There's also some related changes that go into that custom resource handler code to deal with discovery, because you have to serve different discovery based on which logical cluster you're in. And trying to think if we had anything else. We modified the REST options getter as well to deal with if we're doing wildcards and if we're doing partial metadata lists and watches.
All right. So, again, just coming back to the overall point here, I know that the way KCP is written today has a lot of stuff intertwined, and the thing that we've been calling KCP core, I don't see, people are not seeing how to break that up. And again, with limited manpower, to me, that's really bad news. So what I'm trying to do is push really hard. Can we, coming from, with outside-in perspective, think of a somewhat different way of defining the problem and approaching things so that we don't have to have KCP core. So for example, what you just described, it may had some coherence, right? I'm wondering, is there a feature here that we could define and sell upstream so that it could be maintained upstream and would not have to be a matter of fork? Yes, Sebastian.
I mean, I'm just wondering if this is currently the right things we want to look into it. I mean, for us, it's either we find a way KCP is continuing and happy to jump in, but for that, I would like to better understand like how the governance and so on process works. Like, is Red Hat open to take over the or move the stuff away where it's going, or do we need to find, and that's I think Mike what you are talking about, a complete different solution? And I think when we want to find a complete different solution, it takes much more time and much more thinking about what is then the different solution and how to build this. And I think for me, the current stuff, first I would like to start, okay, is there any possibility that we can, the current KCP somehow further rolling? From our perspective, I mean, we don't even need to update on a so regular basis the API servers. We looked into this. Christoph, correct me if I'm wrong. You more deeply looked into this. But a lot of things could stay for quite some time, and then we do things. But it's much more like how's the whole governance and process around KCP. And who can speak for Red Hat? To whom do we
Okay,
need to get Red Hat?
so I am 100% confident that we can work out answers on things like governance. Red Hat, the people involved in KCP are happy to hand it off to someone who wants to maintain it. So there are indeed questions around CI and governance and so on. I'm 100% confident we can come up with acceptable answers there. I really think the gating function is, can we identify work to do for which we have sufficient manpower? I think that's the first question. And I agree with you, Sebastian. There is design work here that we're not going to finish in this meeting. So, in fact, we only have 17 minutes left. So I think we're going to have to go away and think some. We're also, Stefan indicated that can't quite say, he's not ready to say exactly what he can plan to contribute. But okay, so that's why I'm trying to focus on identifying. I think the first thing is to identify something that we have enough people to do. And then I'm 100% confident we can work out how to do it. So Christoph, since you're the one who actually volunteered, you're the only one who volunteered a whole person to do work. Can you tell us what you're thinking here?
I'm cautiously optimistic. That's the term. I'm very interested in keeping KCP up to date. So I would love to work with Andy and learn how to do the dependency bumps and take care of all of that. I think after the first one, it should be easier. But yeah, what Sebastian said, we would be fine if KCP stayed on an older Kubernetes release for some time. But of course, this won't ease the workload that needs to happen when we update. So I would prefer keeping it up to date as much as we can.
Well, I would say if you want to make a long-term plan to maintain KCP core, the long-term plan is you have to, rebase at the rate that Kubernetes is making releases.
Yep.
You can have some lag, but the overall rate has to be keeping up.
Yep.
Stefan.
So rebase is one thing, and finishing the TMC split is the other. I think for those two tasks, we need people.
I'm sorry, what was the second one?
TMC, like number
Oh, yes.
5 here.
Yes.
Removing, splitting out, whatever TMC. Basically cleaning up the main repository from those things where we are pretty sure we cannot maintain it.
Yes. Thank you for explicitly bringing that up. That is indeed part of, I think, what would be done. I was taking it as a given that that would be fairly easy, but it is worth bringing up. So let me ask, how much work do you think that would be? Again, if particularly, if people are not interested in maintaining TMC, it's only a matter of removing stuff we don't want.
This depends on, should it stay, keep working in some sense. And the question for you, Mike, how much do you depend on today's TMC code? Like, do you import packages, these kind of things? Do you use the syncer or parts of the syncer?
Right. In the Edge MC work right now, the only thing we're using from TMC is the definitions of location and sync target. We're not using any controllers. We're not using any other data types.
So the easiest path forward would be basically removing everything TMC related. If we don't find anybody else who wants to invest in a cleaner separation. And you can take over the location type.
Yeah, we can adopt the data types. Sure.
Yes.
Can I ask a question in between? This wasn't talked about, but sharding itself is also something that is just part of KCP core, right? There's no discussion or possibility even to remove sharding.
Yeah, sharding is it's actually not so much work, not so big. It's more like an architectural decision, and it has influence on which informers you pass into controllers.
I should also add the existing sharding is for geo replication, and for the edge work, we're interested in different sort of sharding, which is sharding for scale. And that's new work that we have to do no matter what. And whether we do it as a matter of mods to KCP, if KCP is maintained, frankly, my preference would be to do it entirely client side if possible. Again, because I don't want to be in the business of modifying a server. So I would do it with proxies and/or client side, but get to server side stuff if and as necessary.
The kind of sharding here gives you basically a uniform tenancy view for the user. Like, you can go cross shard from the user point of view, and you will just not notice. That's what we have implemented. It's not pure scaling sharding. Like,
right. It's specifically not scaling because there is components that hold it.
It is. So
but I thought there's a proxy that holds a copy of everything.
So you can scale up horizontally with any number of workspaces on many shards. That's what it's doing. So it's scaling. It's about scaling workspace number. And there's a proxy which routes traffic. But the proxy is just it's one solution. If you want a client-side solution, just do it.
But I think my concern, and maybe I misunderstood, but I thought I heard earlier that the current sharding has a caching proxy.
Yes, this is to give the impression that it's one big system. But it's not caching of everything. It's caching of those objects every shard needs.
Which is what?
An API export, for example. Like, you export an API which should be used by many shards, and this is in the caching server. It's the distribution mechanism, if you want.
So it's the export, not the bindings, that are cached.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, that's much better. Okay. So, actually, this reminds me of something else that's kind of been touched on. I know another thing that was planned to be worked on in KCP, but I think has not really come to fruition, is just the documentation. So I think if we were to if someone were to endeavor to maintain it, I think that would have to include documentation, so that, for example, the sharding is documented. The architecture of all the stuff that's maintained would have to be documented adequately.
Yes. So again, it's rebase and TMC removal. If you want to do those steps, find enough people to do that. Probably after a rebase, Kubernetes will have an impression, an idea whether it's feasible long term. So TMC removal is probably not so much work if you are really just deleting stuff. So it's one big PR basically.
Okay, so just to maybe try to bring this to a conclusion, we're nearing the end of our time. What I'm hearing is that, at least from Kubernetes' point of view, the efficiency is a critical piece of this. They would not be interested in a solution that is a lot less efficient. And they do have one person power, and Stefan has an not yet determined amount of power to contribute. So I think we have some uncertainties to resolve here. So I'm going to suggest a way forward that involves working on resolving the uncertainties. Stefan said we just need time. Okay, we can give him time. Christoph, I think maybe the best thing to do is for you to work with Andy on finishing the 1.26 rebase. That will get you more educated on the code. You can better develop an understanding of what it would take to take this on a ongoing basis. What do you guys say? We proceed with those 2 action items and then gather again in a week and see if we can have more clarity on whether it's feasible to move forward with maintaining KCP core.
Yeah, anybody who needs my time, just reach out on Slack or wherever. I'm fairly busy doing all sorts of random things, but if you reach out, I will do my best to make some time.
Stefan, you have your hand up?
No, it's still up from previously.
All right. So let me just poll the room here. I got a thumbs up from Christoph. What do other people think of this plan?
Yeah, as I said, I really would like, before I commit resources, and I'm seeing currently me the only one who's committing resources from Kubernetes side, having our questions answered, which is like how governance and things like this we are trying to solve future-wise. Because if this is further up the road a problem, then we need to consider internally in Kubernetes what to continue. Do we fork it internally? Do we make it a private repository and really stripping out the stuff we want to do? Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. But to be clear, we do have a threat from Stefan to contribute some manpower. IBM may be able to contribute some. But yes, okay, so it's a fair question. So let's talk about that. I have hands from Andy and Stefan.
In terms of governance and ownership, I would say that KCP is a rudderless ship at this point. So there is no governance other than we intend to transfer it to whomever wants to govern it and take it over. I'm not aware of any legal restrictions or complications other than maybe kcp.io, which Red Hat owns as a domain. And I'm sure we can, well, I won't say I'm sure. I hope that won't be a problem to transfer it out. But in terms of granting repository administrative access and whatever else, assuming we find the appropriate people who can commit to being stewards for KCP, like that won't be an issue to hand that over.
Stefan.
Yeah, my question is basically, which options do we have? I am not an expert in governance at all. So if it's not CNCF sandbox, what else is it?
Yes, good question. I'm not an expert either. My understanding is CNCF Sandbox is a little bit maybe beyond what we can expect right at the moment. In fact, right to even get to CNC Sandbox, there's some process. You would need someone kind of in charge to drive through that process. My preference would be, I'm seeing, so there's at least Stefan and Kubernetes, and potentially some from IBM. So I think it would make sense to have some sort of governance that's not just one company. I'm not sure, what it takes to make that, but that would be my expectation and preference, I think, or the preference from IBM, I think, going forward is to have some kind of a, open joint governance arrangement.
So do we have anybody? Do we have anybody? So we are nearly at the top of the hour. Anybody who wants to look into governance? Sebastian, is this something for you maybe to find options?
Yeah, I mean, I think Andy, I will reach out to you because at least it would be good that we later have something written from someone who is from Red Hat, like how this works. Because the last thing I want is later having lawyers here from Red Hat and we're discussing legal stuff around this, and I don't want to make it too complex. And we as a startup are the ones who are the most pragmatic ones. But typically, it's then the big ones who are coming up with like a lot of legal stuff. So at least some document in the repository which says, okay, how the government and the stuff is done in the future, and which companies, like for the beginning, taking over the government stuff. But I can start, kick this off, and Andy, I will reach out to you, and then we can figure out to whom we potentially need to talk and how to drive this forward. I would propose.
Sounds good, I think.
All right. Any other comments on that? All right. Would let me just ask also, Sebastian, that you keep IBM in the loop. I think our friend Andy, who is not here today, but you usually see, I think he would be the appropriate person to also keep in the loop on that.
Yeah. So potentially, I mean, not sure if next week's, I mean, this Thursday, definitely I will have no update on that side. Potentially next week, Thursday, but it's a public holiday here in Germany. So not sure if I will join latest, like I will try to get something there in 2.5 weeks, what I can share. And if I have something, I will share on the KCP Dev Slack channel.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay. Closing 2 minutes. Is there anything else that anybody thinks we can cover in 2 minutes? Or at least get kicked off?
I got to run to another one. It's good to see
All right.
everybody.
All right. So I think we do have a plan for some action. So thank you all, and talk to you later. Bye.
See you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.